Joan of Arc, the peasant girl who changed the fate of France, Part 1. France before Joan of Arc. By the year 1420, France had endured nearly a century of devastating conflict with England. What historians call the 100 Years' War had transformed from a dynastic quarrel over succession rights into a brutal struggle for national survival. English kings, descended from Norman conquerors, claimed legitimate right to the French throne through their Plantagenet lineage. French monarchs rejected these claims entirely, viewing the English as foreign invaders. The result was a long nightmare of sieges, battles, and occupation that ravaged the French countryside and devastated its population. The situation grew catastrophic after King Henry V of England achieved a stunning victory at Agincourt in 1415. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the English longbowmen slaughtered thousands of French knights in a single afternoon. This disaster shattered French military confidence and exposed the kingdom's profound internal divisions. France was not fighting as a unified nation. Two rival factions, the Burgundians and the Armagnacs, had been locked in a vicious civil war that made cooperation against the English nearly impossible. The Burgundians controlled much of northern and eastern France, including Paris. After the assassination of Duke John the Fearless of Burgundy in 1419, the Burgundians allied with England, turning French against French. The Treaty of Troyes, signed in 1420, formalized France's humiliation. King Charles VI of France, suffering from severe mental illness, was forced to disinherit his own son, the Dauphin Charles. The treaty declared that Henry V of England would marry Charles VI's daughter and inherit the French crown upon the old king's death. The Dauphin, the legitimate heir according to French succession law, was effectively declared a bastard and traitor. When both Charles VI and Henry V died in 1422, the infant Henry VI of England was proclaimed King of France and England, while the Dauphin Charles controlled only a shrinking territory south of the Loire River. By 1428, the Dauphin's position had become desperate. His court at Chinon was impoverished and demoralized. Many nobles doubted whether he possessed the legitimate right or the strength to reclaim his inheritance. The English and their Burgundian allies controlled Paris, Reims, and most of northern France. Without a coronation at Reims, the traditional site where French kings were anointed with holy oil, Charles could not truly become king in the eyes of many French subjects. When English forces laid siege to Orléans, the gateway to the Dauphin's remaining territories, it seemed that France itself might cease to exist as an independent kingdom. Sources used. The 100 Years' War by Jonathan Sumption. Pages 414–442. Joan of Arc by Helen Castor. Pages 34–58. The Oxford History of Medieval Europe edited by George Holmes. Pages 268–285. Part 2. Childhood and Divine Calling. In the village of Domrémy, nestled in the borderlands between French and Burgundian territory, a girl named Jeanne was born around 1412. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, was a reasonably prosperous peasant farmer who held a modest position of authority in the village. Her mother, Isabelle Remay, was known for her piety. The family was neither desperately poor nor wealthy. They lived the typical life of rural laborers in late medieval France, working the land, attending Mass, and trying to survive in a region frequently troubled by the violence of war. Domrémy lay in a peculiar position during the civil conflict. While technically in territory loyal to the Dauphin Charles, the village was surrounded by Burgundian lands. Raids and skirmishes were common. Young Jeanne would have grown up acutely aware of the war's presence. She later testified that she had witnessed villages burned and refugees fleeing violence. The church in Domrémy, dedicated to Saint Remy, formed the center of village religious life. Evidence from the Rehabilitation trial suggests that Jeanne was notably devout even as a child, frequently attending services and developing a deep attachment to the saints. According to her own testimony at her trial in 1431, Jeanne first heard voices around the age of 13, sometime in the summer of 1425. She described these voices as belonging to Saint Michael, Saint Catherine of Alexandria, and Saint Margaret of Antioch. They appeared to her, she said, accompanied by brilliant light. Initially, the messages were general encouragement to be good and attend church. Later, the voices became more specific, telling her that she must go to France, raise the siege of Orléans, and bring the Dauphin to Reims for his coronation. Modern historians have debated the nature of these visions extensively. Some scholars, particularly those writing from a religious perspective, accept Jeanne's experiences as genuine divine communication. Others have proposed medical explanations, including temporal lobe epilepsy or other neurological conditions that can produce auditory and visual hallucinations with religious content. Still, others suggest that, in the intensely religious culture of 15th century France, visionary experiences were an accepted way for an otherwise powerless young woman to claim authority and legitimacy. What remains historically certain is that Jeanne believed absolutely in the divine origin of her voices, that she convinced others of their authenticity, and that she acted with complete conviction based on what she believed God commanded. By early 1429, Jeanne had determined to obey her voices. She traveled to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs, seeking an audience with Robert de Baudricourt, the local military commander loyal to the Dauphin. Her first attempt in May 1428 ended in rejection. Baudricourt reportedly told her uncle, who had accompanied her, to take the girl home and box her ears. Jeanne returned to Domrémy but came back to Vaucouleurs in January 1429, this time with growing local support. Two men-at-arms, Jeanne de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy, were sufficiently impressed by her conviction that they agreed to escort her to Chinon, where the Dauphin held court. Baudricourt, facing pressure from these supporters and perhaps influenced by a prophecy circulating that France would be saved by a virgin from Lorraine, finally provided Jeanne with an escort, male clothing for the dangerous journey, and a letter of introduction. It was a remarkable achievement for an illiterate peasant girl of 17. Sources used, Joan of Arc, by herself and her witnesses by Réjean Pernaud, pages 32-67 Joan of Arc by Helen Castor, pages 61-89 Joan of Arc. A Life Transfigured by Catherine Harrison, pages 48-72 The Trial of Joan of Arc, translated by Daniel Hobbins, pages 51-64 Part 3. Meeting Charles VII and saving Orléans. Jeanne's 11-day journey to Chinon in February 1429 took her through hostile territory. Traveling mainly at night, dressed in male clothing for safety and mobility, she and her small escort evaded Burgundian patrols. When she finally arrived at the Dauphin's castle at Chinon, she faced the skepticism of a demoralized court. Charles VII, still uncrowned and often called simply the Dauphin, was financially desperate and surrounded by advisors who disagreed on strategy. Some wanted to negotiate with the English. Others counseled continued resistance. Into this atmosphere of doubt came an illiterate peasant girl claiming that God had sent her to save France. The famous story that Charles disguised himself among his courtiers to test whether Jeanne could identify him cannot be verified from contemporary sources written at the time. What is documented is that Charles did grant her an audience and that she spoke with him privately. What transpired in that conversation remains unknown. No contemporary record exists of what Jeanne told the Dauphin that convinced him to take her seriously. Later testimony from the Rehabilitation trial suggested she revealed some secret knowledge that proved her divine mission to him, but this may be legend rather than fact. What is certain is that Charles did not immediately accept her claims. Instead, he sent her to Poitiers to be examined by theologians and churchmen. At Poitiers in March 1429, Jeanne underwent several weeks of interrogation by learned clerics who questioned her about her visions, her faith, and her mission. The theologians found nothing heretical in her claims. They concluded that given the desperate circumstances, the Dauphin had nothing to lose by testing whether God might indeed be working through this young woman. She was examined by women to verify her claimed virginity, an important sign of purity and divine favor in medieval religious thought. The record of the Poitiers examination was later destroyed, but testimony from participants indicates that Jeanne defended herself ably despite her lack of education, answering theological questions with directness and conviction. Equipped with armor, a banner depicting Christ and two angels, and a small military household, Jeanne arrived at Orléans in late April 1429. The city had been under English siege since October 1428. Its fall would open the road to the Dauphin's remaining territories. The siege was not complete. The English lacked sufficient forces to encircle the entire city and instead held a series of fortified positions, called bastilles, around key approaches. The French garrison, commanded by experienced captains including Jean de Dunois, had held out for months but needed reinforcements and, crucially, hope. Jeanne's role at Orléans has been subject to considerable historical debate. She was not the supreme military commander. Experienced captains like Dunois, La Hire, and Gilles de Rais planned the actual tactics, yet her presence had an extraordinary effect on morale. French soldiers believed God fought on their side. The English, conversely, grew anxious, some believing they faced witchcraft. On May 4th, Jeanne participated in an assault on the Bastille of Saint-Loup, which the French captured. On May 6th, she was wounded by an arrow during an attack on the fortification at Les Tourelles, but returned to lead the final assault that captured this crucial position. Contemporary accounts, including the Journal du Siege d'Orléans written shortly after the events, describe her rallying troops, carrying her banner into battle, and displaying remarkable courage under fire. On May 8th, the English abandoned their remaining siege positions and withdrew. Orléans was saved. The victory transformed the strategic situation. Jeanne's reputation soared. Towns that had wavered in their loyalty began declaring for the Dauphin. The French army, so recently defeated and demoralized, now believed victory was possible. In the weeks following Orléans, French forces won a series of battles along the Loire. At Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency, English strongholds fell. On June 18th at Patay, French cavalry shattered an English force in a decisive victory that reversed the pattern established at Agincourt. The English commander, Sir John Talbot, was captured. The myth of English invincibility was broken. Sources used. Joan of Arc by Helen Castor. Pages 90–142, The 100 Years' War by Jonathan Sumption. Pages 508–558, Journal du Siege d'Orléans. Edited by Charpentier and Quizard. Pages 34–89, Joan of Arc. By Herself and Her Witnesses by Rajan Pernoud. Pages 89–128, Part 4. The Coronation of Charles VII following the Loire campaign. Jeanne urged the Dauphin to march immediately to Reims for his coronation. This was not simply a ceremonial matter. In medieval political theology, a king was not fully legitimate until he had been anointed with sacred oil in the traditional coronation ceremony. For centuries, French kings had been crowned at Reims Cathedral, where the holy ampulla, a vessel said to contain oil brought from heaven by a dove for the baptism of Clovis, was kept. Without this ceremony, Charles remained merely the Dauphin, a claimant whose right to rule could be questioned. With it, he would become the anointed king, chosen by God, whose legitimacy even his enemies would find harder to deny. The march to Reims in late June 1429 was both a military campaign and a political procession. Reims lay deep in Burgundian-controlled territory. The army would have to cross hostile lands and persuade or compel towns to open their gates. Yet Jeanne's confidence proved justified. Town after town surrendered without serious resistance. Auxerre negotiated a truce. Troyes, where the hated treaty had been signed, initially resisted but capitulated after Jeanne threatened assault. Chalon-sur-Marne opened its gates peacefully. On July 16th, the royal army entered Reims itself. The Burgundian garrison withdrew rather than fight. The coronation took place the next day, July 17, 1429. Charles VII was anointed and crowned in Reims Cathedral according to the ancient ritual. Jeanne stood nearby, holding her banner. She later testified that the banner had earned the honor of being present, having shared in the hardship of battle. The ceremony transformed the political landscape. Charles was now the anointed king, his legitimacy sealed by sacred ritual. The infant Henry VI of England, proclaimed King of France by the Treaty of Troyes, had never been crowned at Reims and would not be until 1431, after Jeanne's death, in a ceremony at Notre Dame de Paris that lacked the traditional authority of Reims. After this triumph, however, Jeanne's influence began to decline. She advocated an immediate march on Paris, arguing that momentum should be maintained. Charles and his advisors hesitated. Some preferred negotiation with the Burgundians. Others worried about overextending the army. When an attack on Paris was finally attempted in September, it was poorly planned and half-hearted. Jeanne was wounded by a crossbow bolt in the assault on the Port Saint-Honoré. The attack failed, and Charles ordered a retreat. Jeanne was frustrated but had no choice but to obey. Throughout the autumn and winter of 1429, Jeanne's role became increasingly uncertain. She had accomplished what her voices had commanded. Orléans was saved, and Charles was crowned. The king granted her family ennoblement, a remarkable honor for peasants. But the military campaigns that followed lacked the clarity and urgency of the march to Reims. Jeanne participated in sieges and skirmishes, but she was no longer at the center of decision-making. The court nobility, never entirely comfortable with a peasant girl wielding such influence, began to marginalize her. Charles pursued diplomatic negotiations with Burgundy, seeking a political settlement rather than outright military victory. To some extent, Jeanne had served her purpose. She had restored legitimacy and morale. Whether the king's advisors truly believed in her divine mission or simply saw her as a useful tool, they now had less need of her presence. Sources used. Joan of Arc by Helen Castor, pages 140–189. The 100 Years' War by Jonathan Sumption, pages 559–588. Joan of Arc. A Life Transfigured by Catherine Harrison, pages 157–192. Chronicle of Enguerrand de Montstrelet, translated by Thomas Johns, Volume 2, pages 324–356. Part 5. Capture, trial, and execution. On May 23, 1430, Jeanne was captured during a skirmish at Compiègne. The town was under siege by Burgundian forces, and Jeanne had entered with a relief force. During a confused engagement outside the walls, she was pulled from her horse and taken prisoner by Burgundian soldiers. Exactly why she was separated from her men remains unclear. Some accounts suggest she was commanding a rearguard action. Others indicate poor coordination during a retreat. What is certain is that her capture was a disaster. The Burgundians held a valuable prisoner, and the English were eager to obtain her. King Charles VII made no serious effort to ransom or rescue Jeanne. This abandonment has troubled historians. Some suggest the king's advisors were relieved to be rid of a figure who had become politically awkward. Others point to the dire state of royal finances and the complexity of negotiations with Burgundy. Whatever the reason, Jeanne remained in Burgundian hands until November 1430, when she was sold to the English for 10,000 livres, an enormous sum that reflected her symbolic importance. The English wanted Jeanne dead, but they faced a problem. Executing a prisoner of war, especially a woman, would be politically damaging and potentially turn her into a martyr. Instead, they chose to destroy her through a trial for heresy. If she could be proven a heretic and a witch, her victories could be attributed to demonic power, not divine favor. This would delegitimize Charles VII's coronation and undermine French morale. The trial was a political weapon disguised as a religious proceeding. The trial took place in Rouen, the English administrative capital in occupied France, beginning in January 1431. Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, presided. Cauchon was a loyal Burgundian partisan and a supporter of the English claim to the French throne. He had political motives for securing a conviction. The trial record, which survives in multiple manuscripts, shows a proceeding that violated numerous standards of canon law. Jeanne was denied access to counsel. She was held in chains in a secular prison rather than a church prison under female supervision. Her questioners were hostile, seeking to trap her into statements that could be construed as heretical. Despite these disadvantages, Jeanne defended herself with remarkable intelligence. When asked whether she was in God's grace, a theologically impossible question since claiming certainty of grace was heretical while denying it suggested sin, she replied that if she was not, she prayed God would place her there, and if she was, she prayed God would keep her there. The answer was both humble and clever. When pressed on whether her voices came from God or from demons, she consistently maintained their divine origin. When questioned about wearing male clothing, forbidden to women by scriptural interpretation of the time, she explained it was necessary for safety among soldiers and that her voices had approved it. The charges against Jeanne centered on several accusations: that she wore male clothing, that she claimed direct communication with God without church mediation, that she refused to submit her visions to the judgment of the church militant, and that she had left her parents without permission. The theological issues were complex, involving questions of private revelation versus church authority that divided even learned theologians. But the trial's outcome was never in doubt. Coronation and the English needed a conviction. On May 24, 1431, facing the threat of immediate execution, Jeanne signed an abjuration. The exact content of what she signed remains disputed, as the document in the trial record differs from descriptions given by witnesses. She agreed to wear female clothing and to renounce her visions, though testimony suggests she did not fully understand what she was agreeing to. In exchange, her sentence was commuted from death to life imprisonment. Days later, Jeanne resumed wearing male clothing. Why she did this has been debated. Some witnesses testified that her female clothing was taken away, leaving her no choice. Others suggested she was assaulted by guards and put on male clothing for protection. She also stated that her voices had rebuked her for the abjuration and that she must not deny them again. Having relapsed into heresy after abjuring, she was now subject to execution under church law. On May 30, 1431, Jeanne was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. She was 19 years old. Witnesses recorded that she asked for a cross and called on Jesus until she died. The executioner was ordered to burn her body 3 times to ensure nothing remained and to prevent relics from being collected. Her ashes were thrown into the Seine River. Contemporary English sources expressed satisfaction that a dangerous enemy had been eliminated. French sources loyal to Charles VII were largely silent, perhaps from fear or uncertainty about how to respond. Sources used. The Trial of Joan of Arc, translated by Daniel Hobbins, pages 194. Joan of Arc by Helen Castor, pages 190–254. Joan of Arc by herself and her witnesses by Réjean Pernaud, pages 215–289. Chronicle of Enguerrand de Montstrelet, translated by Thomas Johns, Volume 2, pages 445–468. Joan of Arc by Donald Spoto, pages 186–234. Part 6. Rehabilitation and historical debate. 25 years after Jeanne's execution, a new trial took place. In 1456, the Rehabilitation trial concluded with the annulment of the 1431 verdict. This proceeding was initiated at the request of Jeanne's mother, Isabelle Reims, and her surviving brothers. It had the full support of King Charles VII and was authorized by Pope Calixtus III. The political context had changed dramatically. By the 1450s, the English had been driven almost entirely out of France. Charles VII, now secure on his throne, had reason to rehabilitate the woman whose victories had made his coronation possible. The Rehabilitation trial heard testimony from more than 100 witnesses, including people who had known Jeanne in Domrémy, soldiers who had fought alongside her, clergy who had examined her at Poitiers, and even some who had participated in the original trial. The testimony painted a portrait of a pious, courageous young woman who had been railroaded by a politically motivated prosecution. The judges concluded that the 1431 trial had been conducted improperly, that Jeanne had been denied basic legal protections, and that the charges against her were unjust. The verdict was annulled, and Jeanne's reputation was officially restored. In 1909, Jeanne was beatified by the Catholic Church. In 1920, she was canonized as a saint by Pope Benedict XVI. Her canonization recognized her as a martyr and a model of faith. The process of her sanctification reflected both her historical importance and the Church's evolving understanding of her case. For the Church, Jeanne became a symbol of faithful obedience to divine calling even unto death. Historians have interpreted Jeanne from numerous perspectives. Medieval chroniclers who wrote soon after her death disagreed sharply, depending on their political allegiance. French sources praised her as a savior sent by God. English and Burgundian sources condemned her as a witch or a fraud. Later historians have brought various analytical frameworks to her story. Some scholars emphasize Jeanne primarily as a religious figure, a mystic whose visions and absolute faith enabled her to accomplish the impossible. Réjean Pernaut and other French Catholic historians have presented her as a saint whose story demonstrates divine intervention in history. They accept her visions as genuine supernatural experiences and interpret her life through the lens of faith. Other historians, including Helen Castor and Kelly de Vries, focus on Jeanne as a military and political figure. They analyze her tactical contributions, her effect on morale, and the strategic consequences of her campaigns. These scholars tend to explain her success in terms of military opportunity, charismatic leadership, and the political context of the 100 Years' War rather than supernatural intervention. Marina Warner and other cultural historians have examined how Jeanne has been used as a symbol in different eras. She has been claimed by French nationalists, by feminists, by Catholics, and by secular Republicans. Each group has emphasized different aspects of her story to serve contemporary purposes. Warner argues that Jeanne's historical reality has often been obscured by the layers of symbolic meaning attached to her. Modern military historians debate whether Jeanne should be considered a genuine military commander or primarily a mascot whose symbolic importance outweighed her tactical skills. The evidence suggests a middle position. She did not plan complex strategy, but she displayed genuine courage in combat, rallied troops effectively, and made important decisions about timing and morale that influenced battle outcomes. The most widely accepted scholarly view is that Jeanne was a complex historical figure who cannot be reduced to a single interpretation. She was simultaneously a peasant girl, a religious visionary, a military leader, and a political symbol. Her absolute conviction in her divine mission enabled her to break through social barriers that would normally have been insurmountable. Whether her voices came from God, from psychological phenomena, or from some combination that medieval categories cannot fully capture, their historical effect was real and profound. Sources used. The Rehabilitation Trial of Joan of Arc, edited by Réjean Pernaut, pages 178, 156-234. Joan of Arc by Helen Castor, pages 255-280. Joan of Arc. The Image of Female Heroism by Marina Warner, pages 1345, 255-278. Joan of Arc by Donald Spoto, pages 235-267. The Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, entry on Joan of Arc by Anne Curry # Part 7. Legacy and historical importance. Jeanne did not live to see the end of the 100 Years' War, but her actions proved decisive in bringing it about. The coronation at Reims legitimized Charles VII and gave him the authority to rally France. The victories at Orléans and Patay broke the pattern of English military dominance that had persisted since Agincourt. Over the following decades, French forces gradually reconquered occupied territory. In 1435, the Treaty of Arras ended the Burgundian alliance with England, reuniting France against the English invaders. By 1453, the English retained only Calais on French soil. The war that had devastated France for over a century finally ended. Jeanne's influence on French national identity has been profound and enduring. In the 19th century, as France struggled with questions of national unity after the Revolution, both Republicans and monarchists claimed her as a symbol. Republicans saw her as a daughter of the people who had risen through merit rather than birth. Monarchists emphasized her loyalty to the rightful king. During the Franco-Prussian War and both World Wars, Jeanne was invoked as a symbol of French resistance to foreign invasion. Her image appeared on posters, in speeches, and in popular culture as an embodiment of patriotic courage. For the Catholic Church, Jeanne represents an important example of lay sanctity and female spiritual authority in an era when such authority was rare. Her canonization came at a time when the Church was emphasizing the lives of saints as models for modern Catholics. She has been particularly significant for Catholic women, demonstrating that sanctity and heroic virtue were not restricted to cloistered religious life. In literature and art, Jeanne has inspired countless works. Shakespeare portrayed her in Henry VI Part I as a witch and a wanton woman, reflecting Elizabethan English hostility toward France and Catholicism. Voltaire satirized her in a bawdy poem, reflecting Enlightenment skepticism toward religious claims. The 19th century produced more sympathetic treatments, including Friedrich Schiller's play The Maid of Orleans and Jules Michelet's historical writing that emphasized her as a symbol of the French people. Mark Twain, surprisingly, wrote a serious historical novel about her, Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc, which he considered his best work. In the 20th century, George Bernard Shaw's play Saint Joan presented her as a proto-Protestant individualist, while films ranging from Carl Dreyer's silent masterpiece The Passion of Joan of Arc to Luc Besson's The Messenger have brought her story to visual life with varying degrees of historical accuracy. Historians of women's history have found in Jeanne a remarkable case study of how an individual woman could, under extraordinary circumstances, break through the severe gender restrictions of medieval society. She commanded men in battle, advised kings, and spoke as an equal to bishops and theologians, all roles utterly forbidden to women in 15th century France. That she could do so only by claiming direct divine authority, and that she was ultimately destroyed partly for transgressing gender norms, illustrates both the possibilities and the limits women faced. Her insistence on wearing male clothing, though it had practical military justifications, became one of the primary charges against her, revealing how deeply threatening her gender transgression was to the male authorities who judged her. Modern scholarly assessment of Jeanne acknowledges the difficulties of separating the historical person from centuries of legend and propaganda. The primary sources are extensive but problematic. The trial record was created by hostile interrogators seeking her destruction. The Rehabilitation trial was conducted by supporters seeking her vindication. Contemporary chronicles were written from partisan perspectives. Yet despite these challenges, the basic outline of her extraordinary story is well established. Joan of Arc remains one of history's most remarkable figures because her story resists easy categorization. She was a teenage peasant girl who convinced hardened soldiers to follow her into battle. She was an illiterate farm worker who debated theology with university-trained clerics. She was a prisoner who faced death with courage and maintained her convictions even when recanting them might have saved her life. Whether understood as saint, soldier, mystic, or political symbol, she changed the course of history through sheer force of conviction at an age when most people have barely begun their adult lives. The fact that she accomplished all this, and then was executed at 19, ensures that questions about who she was and what her life means will continue to fascinate historians, believers, and general readers, for as long as her story is told. Sources used. Joan of Arc by Helen Castor, pages 280–312. Joan of Arc. The Image of Female Heroism by Marina Warner, pages 206–278. The 100 Years' War by Jonathan Sumption, pages 589–612. Joan of Arc. A Life Transfigured by Catherine Harrison, pages 325–362. The Cambridge Medieval History, Volume 7, pages 412–435.